So here we are for the first meeting of the new year in 2024, looking at some national projects that looked at public defense. And I am going to toggle to the next screen and let you know that our first speaker is Ben Polk. And I'll have Ben kind of introduce himself and talk about his research. And Ben, just let me know when to click from slide to slide.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And it's such an honor to be presenting with you and with Matt, and it's such a tremendous honor to be presenting to IDRA. Many of the people that are on this call are people that I cite in my paper, so it's a real pleasure. Yes, my topic is underfunded, but how underfunded, the cost of providing constitutional indigent defense throughout America. My name is Ben Polk. I'm a visiting scholar at NYU Law School at the Bernstein Institute of Human Rights. I come at this from a policy background. So before I was at NYU, I was the global policy director for the International Legal Foundation, which, as many of you know, is a fantastic NGO that builds public defender systems internationally, specifically in conflict-affected countries like Afghanistan and Myanmar and Palestine and other places. And in the course of that work, I really spent a lot of time thinking about how much governments should spend, how much money they should be devoting to public defense. And so when I came over to NYU, I really wanted to look at that question specifically in the United States context. And we all sort of take for granted, I think, that it's certainly something I believe is true, that indigent defense in the United States is underfunded. But I wanted to sharpen that question to say, how underfunded is it, and how do we really know that? Lisa, I think you can go on to the next slide now. So what I'm going to do in this very short presentation, I only have 3 slides, which I think will be of some relief to some of you that have seen me present at conferences where I had many, many, many slides, but I only have 3 here. And I'm going to, because I don't have much time, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the analysis. I'm going to lay out a couple of the sort of key, tricky conceptual and data problems that I'm really grappling with. And then I'm going to give an updated preliminary estimate. I had the chance to present my very first estimate at an IDRA conference, I guess almost a year ago now. And so I'm glad to see that was based on the old 1973 standards, but I've been able to incorporate the new National Public Defender workload standards into my analysis. So I'm going to present a new number to IDRA today. So the analysis. So the question of underfunding really is a question of how much should we be spending versus how much we are spending. We know how much we are spending, or at least have a good approximation based on some fantastic work by the Sixth Amendment Center. But the question of what we should be spending is a much harder one. This one unfolds into 3 subordinate questions. Number 1, who is entitled? What are they specifically entitled to? And number 3, how much does this cost to provide? This breaks down into a fairly basic empirical equation. There's not any complex math in what I'm doing. That's not where the complexity comes from. The equation is essentially the total number of criminal cases in the United States, what percentage of those cases are eligible for state-supplied indigent defense. On average, how many hours per case must be provided of legal services for each case, and what is the cost per hour of providing that? That will lead us to an ultimate number. As folks know, and one of the things that I think is kind of exciting about the way that I'm trying to look at this question is that this simple equation kind of sweeps in a tremendous number of doctrinal lines and kind of in a way that I think is useful, organizes them. And so these are the sort of the key data needs and sources that I need to answer each of these questions to provide each of these variables. So I'll actually start in the middle with what I think of as kind of the centerpiece of the analysis that I'm kind of building on top of, which is the fantastic work that was done by Malia Brink and Stephen Hanlon and others in creating these National Public Defender workload standards. They really answer the question, how much should we be spending on indigent defense per case? One of the big things that they did that was so important is the old 1973 standards, as most folks know, only differentiated between felonies and misdemeanors. But of course, there are much more important gradations within those categories. That presents me with a real challenge because I have to go back then and try to estimate. We know we have a pretty good idea of how many felonies and misdemeanors are heard in state courts throughout the nation every year. But I needed to go down and break that down into the various case types that the national workload standards used. Then I have to figure out what proportion of those are entitled to indigent defense services. And this is a question both of who is indigent and also the severity of the charge. As folks know, in a series of 1970s cases, the court said that it's only people that face a practical possibility of incarceration that are eligible for public defense services. And then that third bullet point, the percent of waiver, is a very, very complex one. And some of the people on this call have done some great work in documenting the fact that waiver practices throughout the country are very often very much in violation, clear violation of what the Constitution requires. So that's the who is entitled. We look to indigence, jailability, and waiver. To what? Look to the National Public Defender workload standards. And then in terms of how much this costs to provide, I'm essentially trying to sort of model out the constitutionally sufficient cost structures for both a public defender office and also an assigned counsel model / flat fee contract stuff. There's a lot of sort of nuances that go into these data questions that I won't get into, but that's the sort of the basic overview. Lisa, I think you can go to the next slide. So just to sort of give a very high level set of thoughts on some of the key challenges that I'm facing in this kind of analysis, I'm breaking them into both conceptual and data challenges. So on a conceptual level, the real challenge is constitutional according to whom? Again, one of the things that I like about looking at this problem this way is that I really lay out the whole range of questions that need to be answered when it comes to what is constitutional indigent defense and how much does it cost. And the truth is that the Supreme Court has answered some, but not all of those questions. But Supreme Court silence on an issue does not mean that the Constitution is silent on the issue. And so I have to figure out a way of characterizing what the Constitution says when it might say different things in different places. Essentially, what I do on this is to look to a lot of treatises for general characterizations of what the Constitution requires. And when there are circuit splits on some of these questions, then I'll choose the least costly. As a general matter, I try to be as conservative as possible in my estimation on this. The data challenges, moving on to the data challenges will be of no surprise to the researchers on this group. The indigent defense world has been called a data desert, and we all know that the data is very unreliable and patchy, especially when it comes to national level data. This requires me to extrapolate from lower jurisdictions from time to time. There are actually a bunch of fairly useful Bureau of Justice statistics data sets, but a lot of them are out of date or focused just on urban counties. So there's a lot of adjustments that need to be made. My general principle when it comes to this is number one is to triangulate from as many independent data sources as I can to make sure that the numbers are at least sort of reasonably robust, even if we can't get to a level of precision that I hope we're someday able to get to. And then the second principle is frankly the thing that my 7th grade algebra teacher taught me, which is to show your work, just clearly document the assumptions that I'm making and the extrapolations that I'm doing. There's a third challenge that I want to talk about with regards to data, which is a really tricky one. And this is the fact that the national workload standards are really the exception in that the national workload standards quantify what we should be doing. But most of the available data doesn't quantify what we should be doing, it quantifies what we are doing. And what we are doing deserves a little bit of credit because trial courts throughout the country know that they are adjudicating under the shadow of the U.S. Constitution, and most trial judges, I believe, are trying to do their best to apply the requisites and the strictures of the U.S. Constitution. But actually, there's plenty of evidence, many documented by people that are on this call, of facts, as I said before, that there are tremendous widespread deviations from what the Supreme Court says should be happening and what are in fact happening. So the trick there is a lot of the data when it comes to eligibility and cost is about what is being spent, whereas what we really need to find out is what should be being spent. And so how to adjust from is data to should data is something that takes a little bit of time, and what I devote a fair amount of thinking in my paper too. So without further ado, drum roll, preliminary estimate is, Lisa, if you can go to the next slide. Right now, my current answer is that what the Constitution requires is that we be spending about $25 billion in state and local courts throughout the country to provide constitutionally sufficient indigent defense services. Compare that with what we are currently spending in state and local indigent defense, and that number is about 6.5 billion, again, thanks to the Sixth Amendment Center. Now, that's the 25 billion is about 4 times that number, but actually the disparity is even higher because that 6.5 billion includes appellate public defense, it includes juvenile public defense, a lot of things that are outside the scope of my paper, which I have a slide in a section on, but I didn't include it in here. But long story short is I think it would be a fair characterization to say that indigent defense in the United States is effectively starved. It is deeply, deeply starved. And the implications of this aren't going to be a surprise to people on the call, but one of the implications is that reform proposals that do not come with attached money are unlikely to be successful. So I'm a huge supporter of things like performance standards, but of course, performance standards generally ask public defenders who are already overworked to do even more, or to do their work even better. And sometimes that's frankly just physically impossible. Another implication that I want to discuss is the federal role, and that I spend some time, and it's a separate question as to why I chose a national jurisdiction, but I do think that the federal government, which contributes a tremendous amount to things like local policing agencies, should be doing more when it comes to indigent defense, not only in terms of increased funding, which it should provide, but also in things like monitoring, setting data standards, and enforcement, things like consent decrees and things like that when it comes to underfunded indigent defense services. And then the final thing I want to say is that the 25 billion is not the important number. The important number really is the gap. And that gap can be filled by increased funding, but it can also be filled by decriminalization. And I think that's a really important thing. And one of the things that I hope that my paper does is not only illuminates what this gap is on the national level, but provides local policymakers and litigators with the algorithm that they need to quantify this in this jurisdiction. And what that's essentially doing is to quantify the price tag of constitutional public defense. And that's saying, as a lot of us on this call, I'm sure, believe, the American justice systems have looked to criminal courts to solve a lot of social problems for a long time. But in fact, if you're really doing this away according to the Constitution, that can be a very expensive solution. And we need to be looking for other solutions besides the criminal legal system to achieve those goals. So that's my brief presentation. I'd love any questions either here or at the end. I'll leave that to Lisa, but thanks for the opportunity to share some of these thoughts.
Thanks, Ben. I was jaw to the ground. I knew I was going to be jaw to the ground with the gap number, but I didn't know that far to the ground. So thank you so much for this research and being able to put this in the hands of practitioners and policymakers and elected officials. I think we could take a couple questions now. If folks, we really do want to encourage that these monthly meetings are back and forth conversation. So please feel free just to unmute yourself or raise your hand, or if you put a question in the chat, I think Torin is monitoring it. But why don't we do 1 or 2 questions now, and then we could save the rest for later. And I am screen share, so I can't see if you have a raise hand function. So if you just want to start talking.
I was just pausing to see if someone else would ask a question, but if no one else is, then I will. So Ben, I'm glad you, even in this very abridged version of this presentation, brought up something that came up at ASC quite a bit, which was the ASC presentation that you gave, I should say, which was this there's kind of a tension between some of these, the minimum constitutional numbers, or the implication, the numbers that are implied by the minimum constitutional standards, versus some other things that are included, like the new caseload standards, which I think would be considered like aspirational, at least in my jurisdiction, right? And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about how you want to resolve that, and or even what do you want this number to be, or should it be a range even? Because for instance, if in Indiana, if you could put forth ineffective assistance of counsel because your counsel had a caseload that exceeded the new ABA caseload standards, every defendant would have a case, right? Whereas in some of the other things, and I know this wasn't super covered in the presentation today, like the indigency standards, it seems like you were really looking for like the minimum. This is what, the Supreme Court has said, like you have to do this at the barest minimum. And so I guess what do you think is the useful number? Do you, and I know I'm adding more complications to something that when you first brought it to me, I said this is impossible. So it's a bit unfair, but I would just like to hear your thoughts on that, I guess.
No, sure. And it's such a great question that I think really goes to the heart of this. I guess my answer is, or at least one way of approaching this is to say this is I don't see what I'm doing as kind of like a descriptive calculation. I see it as more of a sort of a way of using data to sharpen the way we think about what the Constitution says, what is said in doctrine, right? And so to your specific question, the national workload standards, which I agree are aspirational, I think they're actually to be credited for being aspirational, right? They're sort of, they made a really important decision, which is to say, we're not going to make these estimates based on what public defenders are already doing, because we think that risks sort of instantiating and embedding existing inequalities and existing underfunding and things like that. We're trying to look at it from a more sort of ex ante way of doing things. Now, that number, I think that their number is high in a couple of ways, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that they're trying to quantify Strickland, but they're also trying to quantify, and this was brought up at ASC, they're also trying to quantify the bar standards as well, which in some cases go above that. Similarly, I think that their estimate could be criticized on a number of methodological grounds, including how they selected the attorneys that are going to be used for that and things like that. And I really hope, I hope, the people that fund such things will fund subsequent ones to check that. Just so you know, my sort of intention, I think, is to kind of like adjust their number a little bit down, though I haven't done that yet. But that's all to say. So that's the thought when it comes to those. But when it comes to other things, so when it comes to things like indigence and waiver, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to essentially make transparent what I think the Supreme Court precedent is saying. So the Supreme Court precedent on waiver is actually, they have some really lovely rhetoric, but when it comes to sort of specific things about what a judge must say to a defendant or what a judge must hear from a defendant, actually it's incredibly permissive. And you'll see that in the actual data. So there's not a lot of waiver data, but the waiver data that exists shows that, upwards of 35% of misdemeanor defendants are waiving their right to counsel. I want to use those numbers to essentially say to the Supreme Court and to others, is this really what you meant when you said that this is what it should be? Because to many people, this seems like a pretty high number. The same is true when it comes to actual imprisonment and indigence standards themselves. So long way of saying, I'm trying to sharpen what existing doctrine is. So I really am trying to quantify what the Constitution requires as a minimum number, with knowledge that that's an impossible thing to answer as though it was an empirical equation. It's always going to be a question of judgment and doctrinal interpretation that I hope to just make sharper and a little bit more transparent to help us debate these issues in a more clear and precise way.
I think that's a great answer. Lisa, do we have time for one more question? There is one that popped in the chat.
Actually, why don't I go ahead and move through the presentation,
Sure.
and then we can circle back to maybe that question first after we get to the end.
That's
just so we
perfect.
don't run out of time. Great,
Yep.
thanks.
Go ahead.
And thank you for that question, and thank you, Ben, for that great answer. I'm going to now pass it to my colleague, Matt Watkins, to talk about a 3-part podcast series that he put together for the Gideon at 60 anniversary. And I will acknowledge and thank actually Arnold Ventures for being here today, who funded this work. Hey, Matt, I love your background.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to mix it up a bit. And sorry, I joined a little late. Somehow this was in my calendar as starting at 1 o'clock. But I don't imagine there'll be that much repetition between Ben and myself. I relied on his work somewhat, but I certainly didn't attempt to replicate it. So anyway, yes, I am at the Center for Justice Innovation, along with Lisa. Officially, my title is the Senior Media and Policy Advisor. I'm somebody who comes out of journalism and out of an academic background. And really my writ at the center I don't have a law degree. My writ at the center really is to look for our work that is kind of more public facing, stuff that really brings out the stakes, of the harms of the system and what we can do to either improve or abolish certain parts of it or more. And so the idea, and I also host and produce this podcast that we do at the center called New Thinking, where we've featured public defenders before. I'd certainly encourage people to subscribe if you haven't already. The idea of the Gideon at 60 series was to sort of use the Gideon anniversary this year, of course, to introduce people to the decision if they don't, I think people have a general, there's a kind of common understanding that Gideon has guaranteed everybody a lawyer and everything's hunky-dory from there. So obviously we wanted to get beyond that. But then we also, I was inspired by this great quote from Paul Butler, a former prosecutor and now legal scholar, who said, every 10 years ago, we wrote every anniversary of Gideon, liberals bemoan the state of indigent defense. And so I didn't just want to do another series on, Gideon's unfulfilled promise, although it was very important to sound that note. And we certainly did across the 3 episodes. I also wanted to ask kind of some deeper and different questions. The deeper question being in some ways one that, public defenders wrestle with all the time, which is, are we part of a system that's just kind of irredeemable? So even if public defenders got the, what has it been, $18.5 billion that they might need, even if that money came in, would that change? And this is also Paul Butler's question, would that change who suffers principally under the current system? And that is to say, poor people and people of color. So that was kind of the deeper question we wanted to ask a little bit too. And maybe I'll just take you briefly through the arc of the series, briefly, because it's only 3 episodes. Lisa, if you want to advance to the next slide, we need some fancy gestures. So that was our first episode, which we called the Unfunded Mandate, with our 3 guests, and no Clarence Gideon down there in the bottom corner was not one of the guests, but I did want to talk a little bit about kind of the cultural power of the decision and the Henry Fonda made-for-TV movie and such. But pictured there on your top left, if we're all in the same place, you have Keisha Hudson, who is the chief defender of Philly Defenders. And then smiling to Keisha's right is Eve Primus, who is at Michigan Law and founded and directs a really interesting organization there called M Defenders, which works to support aspiring public defenders at Michigan Law. And then next to Clarence Gideon is Alexis Hogue Forjor. She is at Brooklyn Law's Center for Criminal Justice. She's a former, I think, death row public defender. Also, interestingly, a student of Derek Bell and Ron DeSantis be damned. I wanted to bring some critical race theory into the discussion of Gideon. So Alexis was there for that. And that episode was really to, as I say, introduce people to the decision. Definitely run through the massive shortcomings. What the silences of Gideon and the way that, public defense, the mechanism, the way it's provided across the country being so uneven. If you live in New York City, you can think everybody has a Bronx Defenders and a legal aid, but, obviously that's not the case. And Eve Primus knows a lot about that. So we talked about that. I really wanted to focus on, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Yes, the mismatch between prosecutors and the state writ large, and then public defenders and the resources or lack thereof that you guys have at your disposal. There was a very poignant moment when Keisha Hudson from Philly Defenders said something like, she has a very painful moment every time she talks to new defenders coming into the office, when she has to explain to them that you can't be effective. And that's the nature of the system as it's set up. And then I did ask them the question about, look, even if everything was sort of hunky-dory with funding and caseloads weren't ridiculous, how much would that change? And that led to some interesting responses. And Eve Primus pushed back quite a bit on the question, saying, I think it would make a massive difference. And So I think it was really a robust, as people say, and interesting conversation, about 35 minutes or so. Then we'll just jump forward to the next episode, which again, in the effort to do more than just say, isn't Gideon so shitty, which of course it is, but we wanted to do more than that. Talk about, originally we thought about calling the episode "Don't Call It Civil Gideon," but then we thought that was a little too cute. But we wanted to focus on how the fact that massive shortcomings on the criminal side with Gideon, but when it comes to the civil side, which doesn't get as much attention, even that right to counsel on paper doesn't exist. And so what are the implications of that, and an opportunity to really underline for people that the stakes on the civil side can be enormous, and all of this without a right to counsel, lose your immigration status, lose your children, and then this episode focused on losing your home, and everything that we now know. I mean, anecdotally, of course, we've known forever, but research now increasingly showing that the cascading effects of losing your home. But there's this fascinating movement out there that they're not calling Civil Gideon for the most part, to push for a right to counsel in housing court. And it's an interesting contrast to Gideon, because Gideon was like one sweeping decision from the Supreme Court in 1963, whereas the push for right to counsel is very much locally driven. And it's happening in jurisdictions across the country. I forget exactly, there's 16 or 17 counties now and 5 or 6 entire states. So there have been some significant victories in terms of that right to counsel push. And so this episode was more of a documentary approach, where we sort of profiled a woman in Brooklyn in a gentrifying neighborhood, where the owners of her building are trying all kinds of means to get her out of her place. And fortunately, she does have a really quite heroic public defender, Mimi Rosenberg, who's been in the game for decades and has since retired, but is still sticking with this client and her existing clients to take them over the finish line. And we talked to John Polk, who's the head of the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, I think. And then we talked to a couple of local organizers, one in New Orleans and one in Kansas City, to really focus on the role that community organizing is having in this battle. And again, to make that contrast between the overarching one size fits all, leave so many silences, Gideon decision in 63, and then this different approach that I think I said something like, it's slow, it's piecemeal, but it's also working. And the stats, I mean, I'm sure you all know this, are just black and white in terms of what happens when people facing eviction get representation. Eviction used to be just a kind of conveyor belt norm in a lot of housing courts, and the minute they get counsel, everything changes, and it really flips the switch. And then our final episode, that would be slide 3, that is the smiling face of Vinnie Schiraldi, you see there, who briefly ran and tried to do something about Rikers Island just before Eric Adams became mayor. But before that, under New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, Schiraldi ran probation in New York City. And I had been working on another project at the center about probation and the harms of and the ineffectiveness, to say the least, of community supervision. And this final episode in the series, was an attempt to make a connection actually between Gideon and the rise of mass supervision, and use that to connect to some of Schiraldi's really quite broad and interesting critiques of supervision. He has a new book out basically arguing that we should just be incrementally abolishing it and putting the money back into communities. And so we tried to make what I think is, well, not an entirely original argument, but that basically, Gideon, with leaving so many silences, and so the lack of funding that Ben has identified, and the astonishing caseloads that defenders are having to work with, and Keisha Hudson telling people, look, you can't even be effective in this job, that what that actually leads to is plea bargains. And that we all know 90–95% of cases across the country are resolved by plea bargains. and that what that is in fact doing is greasing the wheels of the rise of mass supervision, because defenders can't keep up with their caseloads, accept a plea bargain. Very often those plea bargains are probation, because the prosecution's not just going to accept somebody walking. And then that allowed us in that episode to really talk about the harms of probation, and again, what a more funded public defense mechanism that was able to pursue cases and able to take things to trial if needed, and could accomplish. So that's kind of the arc of the series as a whole. Defenders are, I'm kind of a civilian in this work, but defenders are kind of one of my favorite categories of people in this realm that I've been in for 5-6 years. I do think, you people do fantastic work, and vital work, and difficult. So the series was also an attempt to pay tribute to that, and just in general, and then I'll close with these episodes and with everything that we do. The goal is to speak in a way that's going to engage practitioners like yourselves and get into issues and not talk down to people whatsoever, but also be really accessible and kind of, frankly, professionally produced, so that it sounds like a real podcast, and there's going to be something that everybody can listen to and get engaged with. And that was the goal. So happy to entertain any questions in the 20 minutes we got left, and I'll go back to you, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. That was really impressive what you did with the arc of the series. And for us public defenders and former public defenders in the room, we'll take the compliment that we're some of your favorite people. Torin, could we have one question to Matt too, since we did that with Ben before I talk about the policy brief that I wrote? Oh, I don't know if maybe, oh, hi, Torin.
Oh, sorry, I was I lost my mouse for a second. Anyway, yeah, I'm holding for a second just in case something comes through the chat. But Matt, like, I guess I don't know what, like, kind of the feedback mechanism. This is I think you're the first podcaster on Hydra, so I'm not like super familiar with how that works. But like, what has the reaction to the series been? And from who, I guess, is a important question to me. Like, is it defenders listening to this? Is this the general public that this is kind of the first that they've heard of a lot of this? Or
I think in general, we definitely have a lot of people. We have the kind of Center for Justice Innovation for somewhat wonky audience, but it's broader than that too. So the reaction has been good, I think. I think people have been just mostly, happy to hear the issues explored in a kind of thoroughgoing, intelligent, and hopefully sort of forward-looking way. I've heard less so far. It's more like the most recent one about mass probation, where the connection is not like you need to kind of explain it a bit to people. So it was a little bit more ambitious. That one sort of generated more kind of likes on LinkedIn rather than substantive comments. So we'll see where that goes. Although the more I learned about probation and supervision generally, how terrible it was, I was very grateful to have this opportunity to put that out there for more people.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Torin.
Yeah, no problem. As usual, questions came through while we were talking, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think we should still have time at the end. And I think I also control the waiting room, Torin, unless you can admit a few people who just came through.
No, we Stephen has mostly been handling it, but yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep, no worries at all.
Yeah. And for those of you who are new to join the room from the top of the meeting, my name's Lisa Vavonese, and I work at the Center for Justice Innovation. And in honor of the 60th anniversary of the Gideon decision, we did a series of work one of those being the podcast episodes that Matt just discussed, and the other being a policy brief, which we published that I'll turn to, but I wanted to lay the framework for how we got to the content that we got to for the policy brief, which was by hosting a roundtable conversation in March 2023. It was in New York City, and we invited people from across the country and from across many different disciplines. So we invited public defenders themselves, leadership at assigned counsel or contract or panel systems. We invited researchers. We invited people with lived experience. We invited academics, and we invited some funders, some folks from philanthropy, and said, what if we all had these conversations in a room together? Where would that take us, and what would that look like? And I'm sharing on the screen what the 4 different panel conversations at the roundtable were constructed around, the thematic topic areas, which were developed by the people who came to the roundtable, because before they got to the roundtable, we did interviews with every single person to say to them, what do you think we need to talk about when we talk about the 60th anniversary of Gideon and the state of public defense? So these weren't curated from any expertise of myself or my colleagues, or pursued for any other avenue than this is what the people who we invited to the roundtable said we should talk about. And the first one being recruitment, retention, and what does that mean for a bigger movement? And we used the word revolution with a question mark, because folks talked about recruiting lawyers to public defense, keeping them as public defense, as something that was bigger than having the profession fully staffed up. But what would it mean for the entirety of the system and more fairness for those people that are charged with crimes? We also talked about dismantling the narrative. Certainly a conversation that is had often about what does the media do and think, and how does their reporting reflect on the system and the people that are brought to the system? And what is the role of public defenders and advocates and academics in helping to change that narrative? And in some aspects, move from defensive to offensive. And what would that look like for public defenders as a movement? The third panel topic area was innovating everywhere. And by this, we meant not just everywhere around the country, including urban, rural, north, south, Midwest, but also innovating every kind of way that public defense is practiced. I cannot tell you the number of times that I've spoken with folks and they think that a public defender office is the main and only mechanism, where us who are very deep in the practice across the country know that assigned counsel systems, ad hoc systems, panel systems, flat fee contract systems are an incredibly large portion of the way that public defense services are delivered across the country. So that topic wanted to bring in the geographical diversity, the urban-rural diversity, and also the type of system that is used for delivering public defense services into that conversation. And we purposely said innovating because we wanted to pull out the practices that feel promising and elevate those practices. Because a little bit to what Matt was saying earlier when he talked about we often lead with the massive problems of public defense and our criminal legal system, but how can we energize and lift up when improvements are happening? And then finally, research for the real world. And certainly this feels very close to a lot of the conversations that we have at IDRA, which is you can have beautiful research that nobody understands and doesn't get into anybody's hands who is in a position to change things. So how are we pushing research that's usable and actionable and understandable to non-academics, to non-legal professionals? Like, how are we bringing research to elected officials? How are we bringing research to communities to use for their community organizing or their campaigning? So those were the 4 different panel areas that we discussed, and panels because we invited leading thought innovators from across the country to come talk about those different panel topic areas. And then, based at the conversation at the roundtable, we then polled everybody while we were there and through the conversation that we had in order to develop this policy brief called The Failure of Gideon and the Promise of Public Defense. So we pulled out 4 areas that we thought were those that not only did the roundtable participants poll as the most innovative or promising, but also it's where the conversation spent the most time during the panel itself. And also, really importantly to us at the Center for Justice Innovation and to a lot of you on the call, because I've been in and had a lot of these conversations, we wanted to center the person and we wanted to focus on lived experiences. So we did draw this through a fictional person named Max and kind of walked through what his story would be as it relates to those areas that we pulled out and identified. And we did that through the story of what we think in many places is aspirationally the lowest rung. Like, wouldn't it be a world if everyone who came to the system, who got a public defender, got this level of service as an individual person who's being processed through this system? And how would that look? So a little bit of a different twist on some of the really powerful times that we see in story where we hear the case of a very dramatic failing, and they are way too frequent. This was supposed to be creating the picture in the audience's mind of this is what it could look like for everybody if we brought ourselves up to maybe the aspirational workload standards that Ben talked about a little bit earlier. And the topic areas that we pulled for the policy brief itself lined up similarly, but not completely the same to the panel discussions. One of the practices was early access to counsel, getting in there quick, getting in there effectively, getting in there meaningfully from the moment the person is contacted by law enforcement, if not sooner. How can we do that? How can we be effective? There's much research and a lot of talk around how the first 24, 48, 72 hours are so fundamentally important to what happens for the rest of the case. So how do we get counsel there, particularly in places where counsel is coming much later? So we moved through that topic area and we pulled a lot of the research from that topic area and highlighted some places where they're doing interesting things. The next area was rural defense. That was just so critically important because if we don't fix rural defense and if we only look at urban areas, we're doing a disservice. And it can be really hard to look at rural areas. So how can we be doing that effectively? The next topic area was assigned counsel systems. Even just bringing attention that public defender offices are not the only mechanism for delivering public defense. Like, we really need people to know that that's not a standalone. The 4th area was holistic defense and the important things that holistic defense can bring to clients and their lives and their families. And then lastly, because I do want to wrap up so we have time for questions, we did add what we called adapting the culture of public defense, which pulled on the clearly importance of recruiting and retaining. We have to do that so that we have those public defenders available to take the cases, even if, like Ben said, we had all the money we needed. And also, we have to do better as public defenders, and I will speak for myself, and at every step in the process, from the very beginning of design, being elevating and centering and placing in leadership the voices of people with lived experience. And I would say that was certainly one of the more intense parts of the conversation when we had the roundtable in New York City in March, when it was a participant with lived experience who really had to draw attention to us as the public defenders in the room and how we were describing what was happening, because it is people and it is their lives and it is their family members. So I am going to toggle to the last slide and just open it up generally for questions, because I know that these meetings go by really fast. And I'm hopeful that we can get to a few questions, Torin.
Sure. I can start with the ones that were in the chat earlier, if that makes sense. So from Katrin Johnson, this is for Ben. How did you financially account for other support staff costs like legal assistants, paralegals, investigators, supervisors, etc.? Or did you, I guess, is kind of the other question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll try to answer it quickly. So different ways for public defenders and assigned counsel model. For the public defenders, the National Workload Study asked its panelists to assume their current levels of support staff, but doesn't actually say what those levels of support staff are. There's a somewhat out-of-date Bureau of Justice statistics report that gives national estimates for its support staff. So I used that knowing that it was a conservative assumption, assuming that support staff has grown since that came out. I did make an adjustment for Padilla attorneys. There's a great Stanford Law review article that sort of estimates the absolute maximum number of Padilla consults that could be made. And so I use that to sort of add in Padilla attorneys, because that postdated that BJS number. When it comes to the assigned counsel model, Torin and other people have done really great work on estimating the actual overhead costs. And so I used that, but also some work by Eve Primus to essentially show, at least in my opinion, that the average flat fee contract and assigned counsel rates right now, which Eve Primus says are $65 an hour as a national average, are way too low to support a living wage and overhead and paying contractor taxes, which an assigned counsel would have to do. So I adjust that upward to reflect the cost of overhead, which includes support staff, though I don't, I'm very conservative in how much I adjust that number upward.
Great. And then there was another question, this one for Matt from Andy Davies. And he said, I love the question of whether funding would actually make a would actually make a difference. You noted Eve pushed back on the idea it would make no difference, but where did the question come from?
Yeah, I guess it kind of came from the fact that I was very much under the influence of critical race theory and Derek Bell at the time, and I mean, remained so, frankly, and that's really where Paul Butler's article comes from as well. And actually, I'm just going to put into the chat some links for everybody if it'll work, which it's, there we go. At the bottom, actually, there's a link to the Paul Butler article, which if people haven't read, I really recommend to you. But, so I suppose it's kind of building on Ian Derek Bell's idea of the, racism in America being permanent, and what conclusions do we draw from that? Like, I guess that's where the question came from. It's a kind of, I'm not saying I did a great job of either enunciating it on this call or even asking it in the interview itself. And actually in the chat, I mean, it's a great question from Andrew, and then Bob follows up in the chat, it looks like, and kind of answers it better than I could in some ways, which is, obviously it should go without saying, but I should say it, that, well-funded public defenders is going to make a huge difference in individual clients' lives, as Bob says. It's more about, and this is Paul Butler's point, how much is it actually going to change the, structural harms of the system? And I think, Butler makes the point that, by the time somebody's meeting a public defender, they've already been brought into the system. They're already there. So it's in some ways kind of a provocative question, and I was worried it would be a kind of ungalvanizing one, but I thought it was an important one to ask. But I do want to underline again, I would never suggest that, public defenders should get that $18.5 billion. I mean, we dance with the one that brung us, and we're in this system right now. We need defenders to be able to fight to protect people every day. I would certainly never suggest the contrary. And then I'll just quickly plug, there's links in there that I just posted that you can, on your phone, if you're there, just hit it and you'll subscribe pretty much automatically to the podcast. It'd be great to get more listeners. That'll keep it alive at the center There's a lot of discussions in there that I think people on this call would find interesting. But I really appreciate the questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Lisa, I had a question that is not from the chat, it's from me. So you said the last section was, you framed it as something like the culture of public defense, right? And then you went on to say, we're talking about making sure that these attorneys exist, right? And that's been like kind of my agency's, at least one of our huge priorities, especially lately, as I'm sure it is a lot of places. But I found your framing interesting in terms of like calling it a culture of public defense. Like generally our solutions here are like, pay them more money, pay them to stay in public defense instead of going somewhere else, right? And pay, like have like a loan forgiveness program that's like specific to that. But and maybe I'm reading too much into the framing of it, but like, did you guys discuss like actual like cultural changes, like things about like how public defenders are viewed and stuff like that, and ways to change that? Because I would be really interested to hear a little bit more about that in the remaining minute.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to remember what stayed in the last draft, because it was supposed to be a policy brief. So we had to make it short compared to maybe some of my first versions that were longer. But really talking about like, and I think there are places that are doing this really, really well. And how do we push this out more? But having this like sense of pride of being a public defender and working in public defense and having it be a career choice, and starting from the recruitment through retaining. And you need all the things that you talked about, Torin. Like you need to pay people to have mentorship, to have training. All of those things need to be part of that. But also that sense of like, it's a very dignified profession that we want to aspire individuals to pursue. And I think the reason we went with culture as well is, and this certainly wasn't in the paper, but was maybe on my mind, was that the Center for Justice Innovation, and some of you may have attended, we have a paper coming out about race in public defense that's taking a critical look at how public defenders can be part of the problem of racism and how our clients experience it. And we actually had to maintain that it was looking at how we practice and what that means for practice implications, but also the culture in our own offices and in our own jurisdictions where we accept cases. Because public defenders of color had told us that you can't separate it out, the way my colleagues treat us, the way the promotion happens, from the way I practice public defense or the way that my white colleagues may practice public defense. So part of it was like kind of trying to think bigger of public defending as this culture that we're part of.
That's a great answer. We are running low. Maria asked just for a link if you have one to the policy brief.
Yes.
And I'm sure many others would like one.
I'll pop it in the chat while you wrap us up.
Yeah, I'm happy to do the wrap up, Stephen, unless you had one prepared. But thank you all for coming. I think this was a great set of talks, and I said at the beginning that I was excited to have more time to talk about some of these things, and they always go super fast. So I hope to have all of you back again. Maybe in a year we'll have another. There's always an anniversary of Gideon every year, so I would love to have you all back. And thank you all for coming. This is great attendance, by the way. I think this might be our most well attended, certainly in recent memory. So you guys brought in the crowd, and I think performed great. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Lisa, for setting it up.